I think it's time that we enter the matrix. So, for the purposes of understanding today's lecture, we'll be dividing the history of propaganda into two distinct periods, pre and post printing press, pre-press and post-press for short. Now, obviously we have pre-press as the initial era. So prior to the invention of the printing press, propaganda was about war and it was about religion. And it was about getting those 2 points across as quickly and as efficiently as possible to an audience. So in the ancient world, we see the development of rudimentary forms of propaganda, both in rudimentary technology and rudimentary strategy. For rudimentary technologies, we have things that we take for granted today, hence rudimentary. Architecture and monuments built to honor Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. In the same vein, coinage. You might not think of coins as being a form of propaganda, but if the guy in charge is printed on your gold every time you act as an economic actor, it inspires at least fear, maybe loyalty. Early forms of writing like poems and histories talk about the great heroes of the age. Masks and armor instill fear in enemies and allow you to carry tribal bonds into combat, at least early forms of those bonds. And you have art, early sculptures and painting. And some key strategies include early religions, some nature worship, precursors to organized religion like the Greek and Roman pantheons. A lot of times the generals would implement omens prior to a battle. Military culture develops during this time. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, entering the Middle Ages, we see new concepts develop. So new key technologies include newer implements of war, like knightly armor and Viking longships. You might not think of those as propaganda, but they instill fear in your enemies, especially because of the power that they carry. Same with gunpowder and firearms. Alcohol becomes a unique form of propaganda as generals encourage their men to stay loyal so that they can keep getting a steady supply of booze. And key strategies that developed during this time are the Christian religion, which is central to European propaganda, specifically Christian iconography, the power of the papal authority, the concepts of duty and guilt, and the promise of eternal life. The papal states are also developed during this time. We see an incorporation of conquered people's beliefs and customs into the power group. And an evolution of bonds. We see the chivalric codes for knights and tribal bonds for the warriors, such as the Visigoths. But then, in 1440, the gears of Johann Gutenberg's printing press began to turn, and something changed. The first set of prints his machine put to paper would go on to kickstart one of the most important communications revolutions in the history of the world. Nearly a century later, in 1517, the Protestant Reformation began when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a Catholic church. Firing up printing presses across Europe, newly converted Protestants began to print the Bible in languages other than Latin, allowing non-Latin speakers the ability to access and understand the previously arcane text of the Bible. Printing on a large scale across languages allowed for wider dissemination, but also allowed Protestants to engage in an early form of targeted marketing. These radical thinkers were able to find what mattered to their audience and distill it into a digestible form. Protestants also advocated for a personal relationship with God rather than a reliance on the intermediation of the priesthood. Thus, the movement represents the first non-traditional authority utilizing a mass communication technology to propagandize within Europe. This newfound understanding birthed a number of new faiths which each saw themselves as Christian, yet opposed to the Vatican and its status quo. The Vatican, feeling the cold of the winds of change, attempted to keep the seats of their churches warm by implementing censorship policies. Anyone espousing Protestant rhetoric was arrested and made an example of, leading to many Protestant reformers retreating underground. Existing in secretive pocket communities, the Protestants continued to practice their faith until they could once again come out of the shadows, backed by fledgling nation-states who no longer wished to be controlled by the papal authority. So we have some key points from this section. Propaganda was, for the first time in Europe, directly marketed to an audience. Previously, if you wanted to engage with the Bible specifically, you had to go to a priest and have it read out to you. The literacy rates were poor, and the Bible was exclusively written in Latin. So this is the first time that it becomes accessible to the common audience. And the religion, the Protestant reform also emphasizes a personal relationship with God and a rejection of the traditional authority, which is important for our discussion. Next section is called Capturing the Moment. This is about a very important year, 1896. 1896 represents a massive leap for communications technology over the course of a single year. There are three big things that happened during this year. Lord Northcliffe of England establishes the Daily Mail, which I think we all know the name of the Daily Mail at this point, but back then it was a newly established tabloid. And with it establishes yellow journalism, an early form of it. The concept of pursuing a story by any means necessary with a focus on sensationalism rather than facts. The Lumiere brothers, attempting to capture footage of birds, funny enough, developed the cinematograph, sorry, it's a hard one for me, and display it in Paris. There are, however, debates over whether or not they were the original inventors, but that is not the purpose of the lecture. And Guglielmo Marconi develops the wireless telegraph and demonstrates it in the same year. So in 1 year, we have yellow journalism, we see film, and we see radio. All happen in 1 year, at least the precursors. These are obviously very early versions. But I want to talk a little bit about each of them. So yellow journalism contributes to our problem today because it focuses on selling papers rather than on getting to the truth of things. And that's become a huge problem within our information landscape. It's about getting the story out as fast as possible and not really thinking critically about, who wrote this, especially now, was this made by AI? And so this obsession with beating other people to the story has largely informed some of the cult behavior that we're seeing. We have the radio. The radio's importance as a propaganda tool was readily understood in Europe after its development, but especially in the 40s under the Nazi regime. Goebbels was particularly interested in the radio because he found it easiest to control. Television was not relevant yet, and so the other two main vectors for propaganda at the time were the cinema, which he enjoyed, but you had to get seats in chairs, or you had to get butts in seats, sorry. And I got to practice that one a little more. And the press is wily, as we know, so it's more difficult to control them. The radio represents the ability to enter people's homes directly and pursue them with your propaganda as soon as they turn the dial on. So this is the first device to me that represents this issue of invading people's homes. Sure, people buy it, but you are effectively able to touch them at any point of day with this propaganda. As soon as the radio comes out, you'll see that it gets worse over time, but the radio is the first instance of this. And then we have the cinema. So being able to see real images of real people invokes a different emotion than reading or listening to something. I think we all can attest to that. So it's the easiest of the three to connect to. And the popularity of it leads to the invention of the television. I've titled The Looking Glass. So what's unique about the TV as a propaganda technology is it combines all of the other prior technologies into one. Journalism is done more effectively on here at times than in print. You're able to watch radio shows live on the television, and you get the power of cinema from home. So you have all of the prior technology, and as with the radio, you're targeted in your home. So all of these prior technologies are distilled into one powerful tool of the television. And over the course of several decades, it becomes clear to politicians, especially after the fall of the American consulate in Hanoi is televised, and the Western audiences are outraged. Politicians finally come to understand how this medium shapes public perspective. And then over the next half century, global audiences would go on to watch the Kent State Massacre, witness the fall of the Berlin Wall, see the aftermath of the Battle of Mogadishu, and watch in horror as the World Trade Center was destroyed. These images struck a chord with people far more than any other medium had the power to do, and the term the CNN effect was developed in the late 1990s to explain television's unique ability to influence the outcome of political events. Television dominated the information landscape until it began to be outpaced by something else. Chapter 2, Vectors of the Digital Age. I'm going to do a quick check-in. Can everyone hear me okay? On the internet, the recruitment strategy looks significantly different than any other form of propaganda. Remember how I said during the section about the Protestant Revolution that it became increasingly more and more about targeting people directly? This is where that gets distilled, I think, not perfectly, but near. And we have the online recruitment strategy of current political cults divided between two major types of online content. So private communication apps, which I've bundled under social media for this section, and gaming mods and games. So we'll talk first about playing your program, gameplay and embodying violence. So video games make for an easy recruitment tool. There have been a number of recent studies that have shown that extremist groups, particularly white nationalists, like to recruit participants from video games. They'll go into matchmaking lobbies and throw in slurs or say, Hitler was right or something to try and get attention. And then anyone that they can sort of draw in a little bit, they offer to go into a private Discord server or private Telegram chat with them. And that's how they start to pull them in. So they will jump into the mainstream and then pull people downriver. Video games also allow you to control an avatar engaging in acts of violence and playing out personal fantasies. There have been a number of violent video games made over the past several decades that are explicitly about extremism. There is General Custer's Revenge, which is about a nude General Custer attempting to attack a Native American woman while being fired at by arrows. There have been a number of Nazi-related games made, including a concentration camp simulator where you get to run the concentration camp. And around the early to mid 2000s, we see a shift from extremists making their own games to making mods for games. So we see things like Lara Croft in Tomb Raider being able to wear Nazi gear, Fallout 4 being modded with Nazi equipment and weapons, and being able to sell this stuff in the video game world allows for marketplace power. There was a study that said that about $600,000 had been raked in for extremist organizations through the platform Steam I think it was about a decade leading up to 2021. So this represents not only recruitment potential, but economic potential for these groups. And then we have posting, recruitment made easy. Social media represents an easier recruitment opportunity via targeted ads and posts designed to manipulate the algorithm. It also affords participants an emotional release. Those who are genuinely bought into the movement are able to rage on social media, which makes them feel better in the short term, but drums them up into a greater sense of unease in the long term. This is a propaganda technique discovered by Theodore Adorno in the late 30s, called the emotional release device. Social media also allows for a sustained spread. There was a PNAS study in, I believe, 2020, maybe 2021, that showed that compared to science news, conspiracy theories have a longer rate of standard diffusion across the internet. So where science news initially shows a spike and then kind of levels out, conspiracy theories show steady development across the internet over time. There's also marketplace power on social media. You can market merchandise for white nationalist groups or groups like QAnon. They have plenty of "Where we go one, we go all" t-shirts, which is a popular QAnon slogan. And then we have the internet and online identity. So it's really important to understand is that, like television, the internet took all of the previous forms of communications technology and distilled them into one. In his piece, The Internet as Utopia, Joshua Cowles says, unlike most technologies, the internet could more accurately be called a platform for technology. The revolutionary aspects of the internet are not technological in the traditional sense. In fact, much of the physical infrastructure of the internet consists of the old telephone and cable networks. End quote. So it's a non-physical reality hosted within a physical space that takes advantage of all of the previous communications technology that came before it. There is something different to it and something more participatory about interfacing with a physical object that allows you to access a non-physical realm that the other forms of propaganda cannot give you. Even with the television, you are sort of staring at it perhaps in a slack-jawed manner, but you are not physically interfacing with it in the way that you are a game controller or your cell phone or a computer. And I think that that component of it, that physical component, adds an important dimension. This is something that Seagrave talks about in his article, The 50-50 Problem, where he talks about, quote, your mind is in one place and your body is in another. Your consciousness is exploring an abstract world that has been created by human beings, a world that is artificial, not natural, end quote. Then we have the problem of the rate of consumption. So like I said before, the goal over time, I hesitate to say goal. I don't think it was really conscious. I think it's just been what's happened because it's been a natural progression. You start with monuments and art and things in the public sphere, and then propaganda becomes increasingly more private and more personal, targeting you not in the public sphere, but in your home. And we see this in, again, Seagrave's piece, The 50-50 Problem. Quote, the 50-50 problem is that more than 50% of Americans spend more than 50% of their waking hours living in virtual artificial worlds rather than the given created one in which their bodies exist. The 50% threshold represents a tipping point that renders dialogue, deliberation, civic friendship, and compromise extraordinarily difficult in any society, end quote. Because what's happening is you're increasingly in your own private world. It's not even just about being propagandized to anymore. It's about creating your own space that you get to constantly live in and manipulate and propagandize yourself, I think, in that way. I just want to throw a couple quick statistics at y'all that I think are helpful for the discussion. A Pew 2018 research study on video game use amongst Americans found that overall 43% of US adults say they often or sometimes play video games on a computer, TV, game console, or portable device like a cell phone. And gaming is popular among teens, especially teenage boys. More than 8 in 10 teens, 84%, say they have a game console at home or have access to one, and 90% say they play video games on a computer, game console, or cell phone. And according to another study that measured the use of screens amongst Americans in 2023, it found that people aged 16 to 24 spend 7 hours and 32 minutes on internet-connected devices versus 5 hours and 17 minutes among users aged 55 to 65. So we are increasingly going into these private virtual worlds, and we're losing sight of the world around us in a way that previous propaganda devices did not have the power to do. Next, I want to talk about the participatory element. This is, I think, the element I am most interested in. I think that, like I said before, when you physically interface with the method for propaganda, it's different. I think that because you're physically interfacing, you are more engaged. And so we have this process of gamification, which I would define as, I'm borrowing the definition, the use of game design elements in non-game contexts. So when you attach leaderboards to a classroom, for example, would be an example of gamification. So as you increase the gamified aspects of propaganda, you make it more engaging and draw people in more, which has been shown by studies like Schlegel's, who says, quote, users experience gamified applications as fun and engaging, leading to a greater likelihood of sustained engagement with the narratives propagated through such applications, and thereby potentially increasing susceptibility to radicalization, end quote. I think that this aspect of both video games and social media delays violence because you're able to live out these violent fantasies within the digital environment. I don't think it stops them, though. I think it makes it worse, because when you allow someone to indulge that fantasy over and over and over again, it makes them want to do it more. Next, I want to talk about the decentralized nature of these groups. So the concept of a non-physical community versus a virtual community is discussed in an essay published in the Small Wars Journal by, I think it was Joshua Nielsen. So he defines a non-physical community as, quote, not the same as a virtual community. A virtual community is being on or simulated on a computer or computer network, occurring or existing primarily online, end quote. Where a non-physical one is, quote, a community is a united group of obedient members that do not occupy any physical space, end quote. So the difference between the non-physical and the virtual is that the virtual is dependent on the virtual network. The non-physical will interact through the virtual network, but it is not always their primary method of communication. And so we see this with these online extremist cults. They don't have traditional meeting spaces that you might find with other cults, where they have their gathering spaces, or they live on a compound together. They are spread around the world and are able to interact with each other through the internet, and that actually makes them more isolated and more dangerous, I would argue. There's also a diversity of platforms that are used. So we all know Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We've seen some maybe not so great things get posted on there, especially in terms of extremist content, but there are a number of apps that these groups will retreat to once they are purged from those apps. So Telegram, Parler, BitChute, Rumble, I could go on. But the point is, there is a breadth of opportunities for these groups to hide. And I want to talk about Joseph Goebbels' sixth principle of Nazi propaganda, because I think it's interesting for the discussion. One of his principles for propaganda, identified by Leonard Dube, an American psychologist, was it seemed that Goebbels believed that propaganda had to come from a central authority to be effective. I think that these groups disprove that. In the past, when the nation state as a concept was more powerful, I think that's accurate. But today, I don't believe so, given how decentralized these groups are and these networks are. And then the power of secret spaces. So the number one weapon these cults have is their ability to hide. Most bans are met with migrations to new platforms and even greater secrecy. When Reddit purged the QAnon community, they went to Vote, and then which is spelled V-O-A-T, and then when Vote shut down, they went to Poll, P-O-A-L. So they are always willing to find a new place to go. We see a lot of front room, kind of back room stuff, where they will talk about some of the more palatable aspects of their ideology in the front room, and then like YouTube, for example, and then on Telegram, they'll talk about some of the more terroristic aspects of their ideology in private. These apps allow for long distance communication, so it's harder to track a group that is spread from. I'll be happy to answer your question at the end. I should have said that at the beginning, not a problem. Allows for long distance communication, which makes it more difficult to find people since they're not in a centralized meeting space. Firewalls, a lot of these apps are encrypted, especially apps like Telegram or WhatsApp, and so it's difficult to access extremist chats. PlayStation chats have been notoriously difficult to track. And sometimes these companies obstruct the view of lawmakers, which is debatably noble. if it's done in the vein of protecting civil rights. But it becomes frustrating for law enforcement to be able to track some of these groups over time. And then understanding spread. So I want to talk about two case studies that I think are important. So in order to properly track these diverse groups across these variety of apps and secret spaces, it is critical to learn how to understand the spread of this content. So first we have a study called Waiting for Q. This study followed QAnon believers from Reddit to Vote to Poll, thing I mentioned earlier, and found that they would consistently suggest a new app to members when the previous app was shutting down. So when Reddit shut down or was about to ban them, they said, let's move to Poll or Vote. When Vote shut down, they moved to Poll. And then there was another study done by a research group out of Rutgers that found that extremists that were part of the Boogaloo movement would sneak extremist rhetoric into memes designed to be more palatable for audiences and use the term Boogaloo to convey their message. In this third major section, we have Souls of the Machine. So this is where we're going to talk about the religious and cultic aspects of these groups. So I want to emphasize this. Contemporary conspiracy circles are cults, but it's important, I think, to talk about the term cult because it is ultimately a definition placed on a smaller religion by a majority religion or a smaller group by a major group. So I believe it's important to explain why I call them that. So to define cult, I went to Merriam-Webster and I found, quote, a religion regarded as unorthodox or spurious, quick to die off, also its body of adherents, end quote. But then that demands the definition of religion. So I found one on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that I thought would be beneficial. Quote, in order to define a religion, it must meet the first category, belief in super empirical beings or powers, and two more of the following four criteria, at least. Ethical norms, worship rituals, participation belief to bestow benefits on participants, and those who participate in this form of life see themselves as a distinct community, end quote. The majority of the groups that I'm going to talk about in this next section absolutely fall under the first category and fall under at least two. There are some who do not, but given some of the religious aspects of their ideology, I felt they were worthy of inclusion. And I'm happy to discuss that further in the Q&A. So these modern conspiracy cults share a number of traits with the Protestant reform. They feel persecuted by a majority group. In their case, it is the social media companies that have banned them from their platforms, and whichever government has been trying to crack down on their extremist policies. And in the Protestant Reformation, it was the Catholic Church cracking down on Protestants. They have a radically different perspective on the theology that leads to a schism. In this case, a lot of Protestants have started to leave their churches in Middle America, specifically evangelicals, because their churches do not agree with them on this, on QAnon in particular. And we see in the past, the Protestants left the Catholic Church in response to a theological schism. So we have the siphoning of followers. There was a tour that occurred in 2021. I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but it was essentially a QAnon Protestant tour where these preachers who were pro-QAnon were going around America, and it was like the Awaken America tour or something to that effect. And it was all about how QAnon, the conspiracy theory, was right, and that it was God's will, and that you should join the movement. And so there is a frustrating battle in the Christian community in the middle of the country right now, where many followers of churches who have been lifelong members are leaving because they feel ostracized by their church. This is also a problem with the flat earth movement, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the thing that's causing the schism is a new interpretation of Scripture. So these unique interpretations like the flat earth theory are causing this schism. So flat earth is a conspiracy theory some of you may have heard about. It's the idea that the earth is not round, it's flat. Sometimes it expands to the earth is surrounded by ice, like a massive ice wall, and there's a magical realm beyond it, hence the belief in super empirical beings I mentioned before. But flat earth is actually a Christian fundamentalist movement. A lot of the people who push it are deeply advocate for a very traditionalist Catholic perspective. Not all of them do, but its origins are rooted in a passage from the Bible that states that the earth is flat, has a dome, and is held up by pillars, which is a very dated cosmology that is being interpreted as current fact. Then we have this section on martyrs, saints, and leaders. You'll see a lot of rhetoric surrounding martyrdom and sainthood in these groups. Incel forums will talk about how a shooter who was arrested or killed was a martyr for the cause, and worship them for harming women. School shooters and the people who aspire to be like them regard the practice as sort of saintly. And then we have these leaders who are willing to challenge the sort of nebulous left and are not really willing to define what that word means. And then good works. So in Christian theology, there is the concept of doing good works. And I think that this concept, though not explicitly stated, bleeds into these movements. Because when you believe something bad is happening, to do good work, I realize that that's our motto. Anyways, really needed to think on that section ahead of time. Okay, to do good work in the Christian sense would be to combat that evil. And so by posting this content, by sharing it, by producing it themselves, and by going out and engaging in protests and riots, perhaps they are, in their minds, doing good work. And then there's the existence of dark deceivers. So this is typical of any radical Christian movement where there's a belief that there are sort of dark agents in the world who are trying to deceive and hurt the good Christians. This is rooted in anti-Semitism, but it bleeds into the Americas, or ancient anti-Semitism, but it bleeds into the Americas with things like the witch hunting of the 1600s, the 1980s satanic panic, where things like D&D, metal, and rock were attacked, and now in the 2010s and 2020s we have the obsession with pedophile politicians and the drinking of adrenochrome. And then we have apocalypse imagery. So many of these groups have a unique apocalypse which they are either seeking to prevent or more typically accelerate. For QAnon, it's the storm, the day where Donald Trump and his cabinet will purge the government of evildoers and the world will be saved. For the GameStop stock community, yes, there's a conspiracy cult surrounding the GameStop stock. It is the mother of all short squeezes. So the GameStop stock group, they continue to buy into GameStop stock. Say that 5 times fast. Despite the fact that it is plummeting, hoping to sort of beat out the hedge fund managers and collapse the world economy and become the new financial rulers of the world, which is about as crazy as it sounds. So we're going to talk about navigating the matrix real quick. There's 3 points I want to touch on, and then I promise I'm done yapping. First is censorship. Censorship, especially on social media companies, is a mixed bag. It sometimes shows success on platforms like, not Pinterest, dear Lord, Reddit, not even the same letter. On platforms like Reddit, it was successful in purging the QAnon community, but they just went to other platforms. They went to 4chan, they went to Vote, they went to PolQ. So it gets them out of the public sphere, which I think is good, but they don't really go away. and they go into more private spaces, those secret spaces I talked about. And I think that makes them more dangerous because they're less likely to engage with people around them. So there are benefits, but there are definite drawbacks. And there's also free speech concerns that are not invalid. I understand why people are frustrated by social media companies banning them from platforms. They are private entities, and it is their right to do so. But because it has become sort of the new public forum, I think it's worthy of consideration. But the two things that are tried and true measurements for success are classrooms and community. So my recommendation for classrooms is three things. We need better media literacy education, we need better science education, and we need to introduce, I know I'm biased because I'm a philosophy major, but trust me, we need to implement philosophy education in K through 12. All of these things would inculcate better critical thinking skills in our student bodies and create more civically minded students. And then community. This is the absolute key to de-radicalization. Every single study, every single book that I read, that is the number one thing that keeps people from radicalizing and allows people to de-radicalize, is community. I actually wrote a recent article where I talked about formerly being a Trump supporter and being a pretty ardent one at that, and how I believe I was on a pipeline to be an extremist. It was community that got me out. So my advice is to build community whenever you can, and please be patient with your friends and loved ones who are lost down rabbit holes, because if you come at them with a closed fist, they will retreat. Simulation concluded. Thank you.
Okay, Tom has time to respond to any questions you have. You have a few. I've got some.
Go for it.
I was going to ask like a quick question about when you talked about the different servers that these sites would go back and forth between.
Yeah.
What about, for example, websites where it is meant to be anonymous, so you cannot track down any personal opinions that one person posted. Rather, it is always going to be hidden, so it's not possible to find out who the exact person is or to block them out.
So that's part of what's been frustrating researchers is we can't get access to that data. And I think it's not necessarily a bad thing to allow those websites to exist. They've allowed for movements like the Arab Spring to happen, productive moments of civic development. But no, it becomes incredibly frustrating because we're not able to get that data and we're not able to see what's going on behind those closed doors. Yeah.
When you were talking about the radio and how it kind of infiltrated people's home, what struck both of us was how similar that sounded to podcasts and how there's now like 1,000,001 podcasts that I think a lot of young men go to and feed into this like alpha male stereotype. So I was just wondering what you think about that, like if it's come up in your research at all.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think that the radio moved onto the internet in exactly that form, in the form of podcasts. We see, especially in the 30s and 40s, fascist sympathizers using the radio to manipulate people. And then in the late 90s and early 2000s, you see a lot of these talk show hosts who have their own radio stations who people will listen to in the car on the way to work. And then that might be the only time that they engage with them. But now that they're in your back pocket, you can be working and listening to them. You can be at the gym and listening to them. You can be anywhere and listening to them. So yes, I think podcasting is the new form of it, and I think it's way more easily absorbed, unfortunately. Yeah.
What are the ways that someone can help like de-radicalize someone? Like you said, you were very much on the pipeline to be a radical. What would you say is the best way to help someone stop through the rabbit hole?
Yeah. So they have to want it is the biggest thing. You can't make them because they will feel threatened, and that's the number one thing that these folks are experiencing is fear and the desire to feel strong. As I wrote in my piece, what I really liked about President Trump was that I felt like I could be strong with him. And so when you have these figures who project strength at the expense of others, it's very attractive. So you have to be patient with them, You have to wait for them to want it. So if they come to you and they say, hey, I've been thinking about this and this just doesn't make sense to me, that's a great moment to capitalize on it. Don't snap to it though. Just kind of pull them aside and be like, yeah, like, let's talk about that. Let's tease out why. Because those sorts of conversations are what got me out. Was those slow form. It's a climb, not a race. Yeah.
Sorry, I just had a follow-up question.
For sure.
So, when you said about video games and how they spark a certain kind of interest or a certain sort of mindset,
Yeah.
and then in the end, we're kind of speaking about ways to de-radicalize in a community. So my question is, the thing that I see wrong with history more in that context is that everyone's going to be biased to one side of the opinion, because if I come from a certain land, I'm going to be specific to the beliefs of that land, and then if someone's from a different land, they have that belief. So where could we potentially have like a middle ground taught to us so that we can listen to both sides without having to think that we're being attacked by the other person's beliefs, or we're attacking the other person with our beliefs?
Are you asking about specifically within the context of video games, or just having conversations in general?
I meant majorly in general, because video games are specific to marketing, and then as you
Yeah.
mentioned, GameStop has to be very specific.
Mhm.
So what about in general context?
I think just being patient. I have a couple resources that I'd be happy to share with anyone in the audience tonight. I worked for an organization called Urban Rural Action for almost a full calendar year, and that's kind of their main jam. And they had this thing called the ABCs of dialogue, and we do a lot of B ourselves, of talking about, I forget what B was, but it was like talking about your own perspective. A was asking someone a question, and then C was clarifying that you understood their perspective, or clarifying it was clarifying that you understood their perspective. So that would be my recommendation, is looking at those resources. There's also a collection of difficult dialogue cards that the Adams County Mediation Services Center has on their website. Self-plug, I was partially responsible for making those as part of my work with Urban Rural Action, but I think those are a good place to start. Just finding any way that you can be patient and listen to other people. And if someone's venomous, just don't engage. Like, just be like, I'm good. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think limiting the growth of these kind of groups on like social media platforms is better done through the removal from them, or just sort of leaving them to be openly like ridiculed by like the public? Or do you think that inspires more sympathy from audiences?
It's a really difficult balance, because when you ban them, they can say, oh, I'm being persecuted, and if you don't, they still get to spread their vitriol, and the conditions that make them attractive to people, like the economy not being in a good state, or a lot of foreign wars making people anxious, those things don't go away. So I think striking a delicate balance is the key. I know that's kind of a non-answer, but that's the best I got. Yeah.
Have you seen anything regarding the Online Kid Safety Act?
I have not.
It's like sawing through Congress as usual.
Yeah.
But it was founded by a lot of the families who would come forward where like their children would, commit suicide after like being online. There was one kid who like almost like fell in love with like this AI character.
I do know what you're talking
Yeah, and
about.
so they kind of pushed this legislation of making it harder for kids to get on online access, but then also like specific accounts for minors where like they couldn't get as much of I forget how what term they used, but it wouldn't be so like addicting to stay on. So maybe some like the autoplay features on like TikTok or YouTube or something like that.
Yeah.
But then also again you have the media companies being like, oh, well, free speech, and this is going to be used. But do you think a legislation like that could be helpful in keeping kids safe, but then also in making sure they never go through such a radicalization?
Absolutely. Yeah. Excuse me. 100%. That cookie's coming back up. I'm fine. 100%. I saw Australia actually just passed a law that no one below the age of 16 can access social media, period. I think that's a little reductive. I would more lean towards Megan, I see you taking the photo. That's cute. I would, thank you. I'll look forward to posting that later. I lean more towards the American perspective. Students should be able to, similar to my policy surrounding things like alcohol. Children should be able to access. I'm talking about like teenagers. Let's be serious. I'm not talking about a 5-year-old. Young people should be able to access these things early so that when they are actually fully exposed to the stuff, they're not at a loss with all of the new information. So I think a slow build process would be the best way to go. Yeah.
And then when you talk about philosophy in like education for
Mhm.
younger kids, what sect of philosophy do you think probably would work best in sort of instilling like I guess proper values in them, or just going over the major ones like utilitarianism, consequentialism, things like that?
Yeah. I think ethics and logic are the two branches that I would really focus on. I think metaphysics and epistemology are going to throw kids just completely in a tizzy. It's too much. It's too much for me sometimes, and I was a major. So yeah, I think ethics and logic paired together in a class so that students can start to play with those concepts early, be able to form rational arguments of if A then B, rather than sort of these ad hominem things that we're so used to. And then also build good ethical values, not by forcing students to have a perspective, but encouraging them early on to buy into a shared small set of American values that we can all agree on: fairness, community, cooperation, things like that. And then building their own philosophies by reading different things and presenting to the class. Like one kid could do utilitarianism, another person could do Mengs's ethics, someone could do Confucian ethics, all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
You mentioned advocating for spaces of community to help people get out of that cult-like behavior. Would you believe that it would be beneficial for advocating for, because I know like within usage of social media provides a community space. It is a very positive outcome, especially with the concern over banning TikTok, where a lot of people feel like it has such an outreach that they're able to gain with interactions with people that they have community with that they would never be able to engage with in person. That would it be a positive shift to advocate for these community spaces in person rather than online? Because I know that's why a lot of people also engage with church, just because it's this kind of community that's not your family, it's not school, it's not your friends, it's just these people that share a common belief. Where advocating for that same space, but just not tied to religion, that would also be a positive shift, like away from the community social media is able to provide.
100%. The problem is the online interface. You are wholly disconnected from the world around you, and it doesn't matter if you're connecting with people from all over the world every single night. You feel alone at the end of the day when you click that button and you log off because they're not right next to you. That's the biggest thing. So joining clubs, creating new clubs, and again, they don't have to be faith-based. And I also want to say, religion has actually been shown in Theodore Adorno's piece, The Authoritarian Personality. It is not a cause of this behavior. It is a personality defect that is the problem, and that's what's capitalized on. The religiosity can actually be a good thing. It can prevent you because it provides community. So I just wanted to make sure that I touched on that. But yeah, absolutely. Secular or religious, community, in person, best way to go. Did you have a question before?
Oh yeah, I did. It was about it was just about like when and like the market for children's like television came around and how that was like geared towards like filling in the gaps where education wasn't uh, meeting like standards or this or that. But if you found anything there with like I don't know with that. But then it's just
I think that's just not an avenue I've explored much yet, but I'd like to more. That sounds interesting. Yeah. Yeah, Professor.
Oh yeah, the one thing that I had questions about is a great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
Where you started to discuss the difference between cults and religion, and also this other kind of tension within the presentating communities. Ersatz are replacement communities that you have online, or perhaps you have in cults, even if the cult might be face to face, and the more genuine community of say patience and dealing with other human beings and all of their complexity, not requiring them to be just another maybe a projection of their expectations, right, or the faith position, whatever it happens to be. It seemed to me that you can, and maybe you did touch on this, but religion can do that. It can and does do this. And really for people who are not, reading a ton of Descartes, right? Or reading a lot of philosophy, this can serve that function. And so one case, I don't know whether you've heard of it, Derek Black, who was the son of this guy who ran, not the Daily Stormer, it was this other right-wing, not just right-wing, it was like a neo-Nazi website that his father ran. And he was expected to sort of inherit this, right? So he goes to some college in Florida, and he's spouting all this. He isn't spouting this stuff. He's trying to like stay hidden. But the students sort of found out who he was, right? And some of them, wanted him to be thrown out because of who he was. But this group of Jewish students actually said, "Hey, why don't you just come over on Friday for Shabbat, and we'll talk to you." And this is the thing that got him out, right? Was having conversations with people face to face, where he's actually meeting these people who he maligned through all these ideologies and so on. That was the thing that drew him out. So I think some emphasis on, and maybe a little bit less religion bashing, maybe might help in sort of conceiving of how these communities can be genuine forces of de-radicalization.
That's a great point. Yeah, I'll take
But
that.
Derek Black, and then a group that does this, or tries to do this like routinely, is Life After Hate.
Yes, I follow them. Yeah, they're great. Yeah. But that's a great point. I'd like to incorporate that into another talk about the impact that it can have positively. Yeah. There's no
Questions? All right, well, then thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you. This is my first ever formal lecture, so this means a lot. So thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it.